So like I promised you, I promised that I was going to do a review of this book, African Nationalism, that was written by Ndabaninge Sutole. He was a Zimbabwean nationalist, and he was one of the very first African to write about African nationalism. So chapter 2 of his book is what we want to discuss today. And this book is very important for us. Why? Because it was published just a year after the first African country got its independence. Ghana got its independence in 1957, and then this book comes out, the first edition of the book comes out in 1958, published by Oxford University Press. Another article that I want us to put into consideration, I'll give you the notes that contains the details of these publications so that you can get to see them. But another article that I also want us to pay attention to is one that was written by Professor Rothbeck. It's also called African Nationalism, the Concept or Confusion. It was published by the Journal of Modern African Studies in 1966. So if you look closely at the dates of the publications of this work, you'll see that one is 1958, the other is 1966. So these are very important dates because these scholars or these historians are writing right at the point at which all this stuff was happening. So it's actually being written in real time. One is an African scholar, one is an American scholar, so we are able to get the narratives from two different perspectives. One that is African and one that is American, or that would probably represent the interpretation of the Western world of what was happening in Africa at that particular time, that which we call African nationalism. But now, let's just start at a simple stage of defining what is meant by African nationalism. So what I will tell you for a fact is that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to define African nationalism because the decolonization movement itself, it unfolded in various ways, in various forms across different countries. So it wasn't one and the same thing across all the over 54 countries that we have on the African continent. But now, here is what is generally accepted by most historians as the definition or the generally accepted meaning of what African nationalism is. But it is generally defined as a series of political movements that spanned from about the 1940s up until the 1990s. But it was characterized by civil disobedience, strikes, protest movements, negotiated settlements, and armed struggles. These are just examples of the kind of protest action that was taken by Africans to resist or to show their resistance or the feeling of resentment of the institution of colonialism and white minority rule. So that is what we just simply mean when we say African nationalism. So now, another question that is important for us to answer is that who was a nationalist or who was an African nationalist, if this is the generally accepted definition that we have. So a nationalist would be that person who formed or led the movement that is defined by all these tenets that you see right there. So mostly if you are going to come across in your history books and all the other scholarly works that you read, if it says African nationalism or if it says nationalist, that is what is being simply meant by whatever you are going to see. I don't want you to be confused by these terms when you come across them. That is what they simply mean. So now, there's one particular aspect that is very important about defining who a nationalist was. Because these people formed or led the movements that spearheaded and that operationalized all these tenets that you are seeing. These were mostly highly educated Africans. They were not just average people or the average person in an African country. These were highly educated people that knew very well how to organize a movement and how to organize the struggle. So that is where the big discussion and the big debate begins. If it was a group of highly educated people, it means that it was a group of African elites that spearheaded this movement. And but by that very fact, it simply means that it was an elitist kind of movement. But the masses or the generality of the population is not so much talked about when we read the literature, because it's always referring to the African nationalist or the African leader of the movement. But now, remember I told you that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to define what African nationalism is. Why? Because there were varied paths towards attaining independence. It's very problematic because this group of people that we call nationalist leaders, they had different ideological standpoints. So if I'm saying different ideological standpoints, I'm saying that they had a different interpretation as to how the struggle for independence, or how the struggle, the fight against colonialism and white minority rule must unfold. They all didn't agree on one and the same way or the uniform way of attaining independence. So that means that they had different religious, political, ethnic, tribal persuasions that made them fight the war of liberation, or influenced by those ideological underpinnings that control their thought process and the interests that they want to achieve immediately after the dismantling of colonial rule. That's number one. So number one is differences between the nationalist leaders themselves is what gives a problem to defining African nationalism. Number two, the movement or the various political organizations that championed African people's rights and that championed it for independence or for self-determination, they were also influenced by colonial authorities. So that itself compromised the movement and how it was organized to realize its goals and to realize its interests. So that became a very big problem. So we have two big problems. One, that the nationalists don't agree on one and the same thing. They don't agree on how to organize and how to execute should be taken to decolonize their countries or to achieve African nationalism. That's number one. Number two, the movement itself was controlled and influenced by colonial authorities to the extent that some of them did not work wholly to advance the rights of Africans, but to actually advance the interests of the colonizers or the imperialists. Because there was no way in which the colonizers would give the colonized the tools to liberate themselves. That is what you must know. So now, against that backdrop, we want to study closely the ideas that are then discussed by this scholar, Dabaningi Story, in his chapter 2. The ideas that he says are the ones that created and accelerated this movement that we're talking about. But before we get to move into those factors, I want you to remember that from the time of the Berlin Conference up until 1945, when the Second World War ends, that's a lot of years. That's a lot of decades right there. So those are decades of colonialism and white minority rule. Those are decades of the consolidation of all those forms of policies that we discussed that were implemented by colonizers in different African colonies to control Africans. So that's a very long period of time. And when we read the history of how Africans lived through colonialism during that time, we don't necessarily see an organized movement at a very large scale that champions African nationalism and the decolonization movement. We only get to start to see that right immediately after the Second World War ends. We start to see an organized way. We start to see a systematic way of challenging colonial rule right immediately after the Second World War ended. So that is the reason why historians ask themselves the question that, was there anything spectacularly and particularly, or if I can say, outstandingly unique about the Second World War that facilitated the rise of African nationalism and the decolonization movement? So the answer is not so clear because there is a huge debate. Others believe that the Second World War played a role. Others believed that it didn't. Others believed it was a combination of factors, and there are so many different arguments that are advanced. But now, we want to start from the very point of appreciating and acknowledging that the whole idea of self-determination, the whole idea of independence, and the whole idea of freedom was not brought about to African people by the Second World War. That you will agree with me. Because if we look back into the history, throughout the course of colonial history, of colonial African history, we're going to see that the demand for self-determination always expressed itself. Because remember, the definition of African nationalism encompasses all these things. And if we were to look into African history before the beginning and the end of the Second World War, we are going to see that at some point Africans were involved in activities that fall into this category. So it wasn't brought by the Second World War. That idea was already in the African. Even before the coming of European rule, you are going to see that Africans resented being controlled by other different African ethnic groups. So the idea of freedom, the idea of independence, the idea of self-determination was already there within the African. But now, the biggest question is, what did the Second World War do differently to accelerate that demand that was already there? That is what we want to look into. So number one, what you need to write down as a factor of African nationalism is the Second World War. So write that down. And when we look at the Second World War, we are particularly and specifically concerned at studying the recruitment, the mobilization, the wartime experiences, the demobilization and the reintegration experiences of those African soldiers that participated in the Second World War. We want to really study closely and see that was there anything about this war that inculcated in these Africans or espoused ideas of anti-colonial resistance to such an extent that when the war ended, these troops came back to their countries and influenced the people that did not fight the war, or even in some cases themselves take up action to challenge European rule. So we can only do that by digging into the evidence that is there historically, that we can hear from the African ex-servicemen themselves to see what their experiences were. That will make us be able to understand the extent to which this war impacted African soldiers. So now, the recruitment and mobilization part is not so important to us at this point. Why? Because we talked about it in a previous class. So what we want to particularly focus on is what we call wartime and demobilization, or maybe reintegration experiences, so that we understand that that which was inculcated in the mind of the African during the war and during the process of recruitment, was it visible in his mind and in his lifestyle right at the point of demobilization and reintegration. So I'm going to read you a few quotations that I'm going to draw from the evidence that was gathered by historians and newspaper articles from The Guardian to see and understand the extent to which the war impacted the psychological makeup of the African men who participated in that war. I'm going to read you a quotation from a Malawian soldier who fought in Burma. And this is what he says about his wartime experiences. I learned one thing in the army. The European is very timid. If you are bullied by the European men, you respond with your fists. If you are bullied and do nothing about it, then you have only yourself to blame. Even if it costs you your job, it is better to go out swinging, not just take it and end up mentally fragged. I'll look at Kenyan soldier. His name is Kenneth. He fought in Burma, in what is called the Burma campaign. So he notes that our unit was made up of soldiers from all backgrounds, rich, poor, white, black, and colored. They have to say that these whites are nothing other than ordinary human beings. They are not gods. Death knows no color. A European was wounded, shot in the back by some Japanese who had hidden in the water while washing mess tins in a river. I immediately jumped into the river and fought the two Japanese with my bare hands. If I had not done so, he would not have survived. This is what another colored soldier says. Before we went outside the country, we always felt the European was superior to the African. But when we were there, things changed. We have been exposed to the world. If we are just as good, if not better than them, then why should they rule us? So when we look at this, when we look at these perspectives that the Africans are telling us at the point of demobilization, we are able to tell that there was something particular about that war. So what we see right here is the demystification of European supremacy. This is what we're exactly seeing from these quotations. And why is that an important aspect for us? It is important because I want you to remember that for almost decades and decades, 5 if not 6 decades of colonial rule in Africa, African men were used to working for their European colonizers at the mine, at the farm, and in the civil service. And there was no way in any way that they worked side by side with their European colonizers doing the same thing, and even to the extent that the Europeans would learn from them. They were always colonial subjects. But the psychological experience of going to war and going to fight side by side with them and realizing some of these things was to play a very important role when these guys came back to their motherlands. They started to influence the rest of the society to think the way they think because of the experiences that they had had. So this is why we point to the Second World War as a very spectacular or watershed event that then gives birth and accelerates this whole movement that we want to talk about. And we are particular about the end of the Second World War because that is what brings the demobilization and reintegration of people who have a mentality like this. That's number one. So now let's move to the second point, which is the United Nations, or the creation of the United Nations. I want you to write that down. And the United Nations is a very important organization to us at this point because it's still in existence. So we are able to trace some of the historical origins of it through histories like this. So now, when we look at the United Nations, our particular focus and concern is on what we call Article 73 of the Establishment Charter of that United Nations. So when this organization was formed, they adopted a charter, which is a document that prescribes what the organization wants to do and wants to achieve. So even up until today, this charter is still in existence. Of course, it's an important charter to study because of its mission to help African nationalism and the decolonization movement. So now, let us look at Article 73 and what it says and see whether it was going to help African nationalism and the decolonization movement. I'm going to read you what Article 73 says, and then we can discuss the meaning of that. So I'm reading it straight from Dabaningi Stole's book, which I recommended to you. So here's what it says, Article 73. It says members of the United Nations which have or assume responsibilities for the administration of territories whose peoples have not yet attained a full measure of self-government, recognize the principle that the interests of the inhabitants of these territories are paramount, and accept as a sacred trust the obligation to promote to the utmost within the system of international peace, security, establishment by the present charter, the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories, and to this end, to develop self-government to take due account of the political aspirations of the peoples and to assist them in the progressive development of their free political institutions, according to the particular circumstances of each territory and its peoples and their varying stages of development. I'll read that last part because that's the most important part. To develop self-government, take due account of the political aspirations of the peoples and to assist them in the progressive development of their free political institutions, according to the particular circumstances of each territory and its peoples and their varying stages of development. What do you think about this article? What does it say? What does it imply? What stage does it set in the political evolution process that is accelerating what we are looking at right now? What do you think? It's promoting the idea of self-determination. So if the United Nations as a body, as an international organization that has been formed right after the end of the Second World War, if it is promoting self-determination by means of legislation, by making it a law that as an organization we are existing or we are establishing ourselves to operationalize an idea that promotes self-determination, it means it was setting a very good center stage for the development of African nationalism and the decolonization movement. And this was going to work out very well. I'll give you some of the most interesting examples that will make you understand why we say things had changed right after the end of the Second World War. Remember that our particular focus is to try and show that right before the Second World War began, the political landscape on the African continent was very different as compared to what it was when the war ended. Because when the war ended, internationally it was possible to advance an idea of African nationalism and decolonization with the assurance that organizations and movements that are championing for self-determination would get the backup of internationally renowned organizations like the United Nations. That was a very, very important development that then gives birth to a whole movement of decolonization, which we are saying it spans right after the establishment of this United Nations. So at every given point, you shall see in your readings that African leaders of these liberation movements would actually go to the United Nations to remind them that Article 73 talks about self-determination. We still don't have it in our countries. Could you please help us attain it? Could you please help us get it? And it was very possible for them to get that support